If you're familiar with Ice Age movies, you'll see that all the problems in the film always seem to start with either this guy chasing his acorn or falling meteors heading straight for Earth. And if you're like me, you probably grew up with a lingering fear of falling meteors wiping us all out. However, the reality of this is a bit different from Hollywood's version. You see, Earth has a unique system that protects us from being crushed by falling space rocks, otherwise known as meteorites. Unlike the dramatic scenes we see in movies, most meteors never even make it to the ground. This is because of the atmospheric pressure on Earth. In the event that a meteor enters Earth, the low air pressure on the upper atmosphere causes the meteorite to heat up and break apart into smaller pieces before they reach the ground. Sometimes these burning rocks are what we see as shooting stars in the sky. This, however, does not erase the fact that there have been recorded instances of meteors surviving the heat and crashing into Earth with devastating effects. One such case was the Tunguska explosion in 1908. The incident, which occurred near the Podkamenaya Tunguska River in Russia, happened with a twist that ended up becoming a mystery for years. For over 19 years, no scientific expedition attempted to investigate the cause of the explosion, and many were left speculating and debating the circumstances surrounding the explosion. The local residents in the areas ascribed it to be some sort of punishment from their god of thunder, Ogdi. But before we go on about the speculations, let's get right into the story. On the morning of June 30th, 1908, residents of the Podkamenaya Tunguska area of Russia were woken by a deafening blast followed by sounds that shook the ground as if giant cannons were being fired into the village. The force of the explosion was so intense that it shattered their windows and threw them off balance. Those who were in their farms reported being violently thrown against the trees and having to hold on to the shaking ground to stabilize themselves. Seismic shock waves were felt thousands of miles away in Germany, Denmark, and even as far as Batavia and Washington, D.C. At the time, scientists estimated the impact of the explosion to be about 4 megatons of TNT. That would make it 250 times more powerful than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima, meaning that the blast would have completely wiped out a well-populated city. Thankfully, the explosion happened in a remote area that was only occupied by a handful of local residents, so only 3 casualties were recorded, alongside the many injured ones. The remoteness of the crash site would later contribute to the reason for the delayed investigation and eyewitness accounts. According to the residents, they noticed a bluish light that was as bright as the sun suddenly moving across the sky just before the explosions. However, because of the internal conflicts and growing tension of World War I, the government got distracted from investigating the cause of the explosion, and the site would be left undiscovered until 1927, when Leonid Kulik, a renowned mineralogist, led a Soviet-sponsored research expedition to investigate the Tunguska explosion. Because of the remoteness of the area, Kulik and his men had a hard time accessing the blast site. But as they got closer and closer, they started to see unmistakable signs of an explosion. In his observations, he noticed that farther away from the blast site, the trees were completely flattened down. But the closer they got to the blast site, the more the trees surrounding it were standing upright. Even though they appeared to be scorched by some kind of fire that wasn't as intense as a forest fire, they were completely dry and stripped of their leaves and branches. In their minds, the extent of the damage they saw could only have been done by a giant meteor. But when they reached the center of the area, what they found defied all logic. Instead of a giant meteor or crater sitting in the middle of the destruction, all they found was a clear, empty space in the shape of a butterfly. There was no dent on the ground to suggest the effect of any impact from a fallen meteorite. It was as if whatever caused the destruction had vanished. With no meteorite impact or crater, Kulik and his team left Tunguska even more confused than ever. In the years that followed, more scientific expeditions were sent to investigate the area, but none provided an explanation for the explosion that happened in 1908. In the absence of any evidence, many people started to debate and speculate possible explanations for what caused the explosion. One of the theories claimed that the explosion was caused by an artificially engineered nuclear blast that the Russians had been experimenting with. The remoteness of the blast site, as well as its low population, made it an ideal testing ground for a weapon of mass destruction. The absence of concrete evidence also fueled the suspicion that the government had intentionally detonated the weapon in order to bury their evidence. While this seemed to make sense, the theory was mostly rejected because of the fact that the explosion happened in 1908 and nuclear weapons and technologies hadn't even become a thing at the time. Another theory suggested that the explosion was caused by a comet entering Earth. The comet, also known as a small, icy body of dust, rock, and frozen gases, must have heated up upon entering Earth's atmosphere and exploded before even touching the ground. The force of the explosion would have then flattened out the trees, leaving no solid evidence but vapor in the atmosphere. This would explain the eyewitness accounts of the bright bluish light that they saw shooting across the sky moments before the explosion. It also supported the reason why the night skies in Asia and Europe were bright for a number of days. The closest anyone came to explaining the mystery behind the Tunguska explosion was when Leonidovich Krenov, a Russian astronomer and geologist, estimated that a meteorite the size of about 50 to 60 meters wide had indeed entered Earth. After seeing the extent of the destruction caused by the explosion, Krenov was fully convinced that what happened was indeed caused by a falling meteorite. He just needed to prove it. However, his plan to gather evidence to explain the meteor impact was forcefully cut short due to the brewing of the Second World War. It would take another several decades before another scientific investigation would pick up Krenov's initial theory and establish the truth. In 2013, a team of international scientists analyzed microscopic samples of the dust, sand, and rocks collected from the blast area. There, they discovered that the samples contained traces of meteorite particles. It turned out that the reason for the confusion and lack of evidence of meteor impact was because the meteor never reached the ground. According to their analysis, the extreme pressure of Earth's atmosphere had caused the meteorite to heat up and burn, resulting in its forceful explosion mid-air, also known as an airburst. It turned out that the evidence had always been right there in the open. No one had just ever thought to look at the tiniest particles for answers. However, we cannot rule out the possibility of Krenov solving the mystery earlier if he had enough time for his research. And so, over 100 years later, the century-long myth of the Tunguska explosion was finally demystified. A giant meteorite had indeed entered Earth. However, the atmospheric pressure and heat caused it to explode mid-air before even reaching the ground. Although the Tunguska explosion is not the only case we've had of meteors falling on Earth, it remains the largest impact event on Earth in recorded history, and thankfully, it happened in a sparsely populated corner of the world. In February 2013, another meteor hit southern Russia at a speed of 19 kilometers per second. The meteor, which struck Chelyabinsk Oblast, was seen as far as 100 kilometers away in some republics of the Russian Federation. Thankfully, this meteor also exploded in an airburst, to producing a hot cloud of dust and gas. Although the blast shattered windows and caused a number of injuries and hospitalizations, no casualties were recorded from the blast. But this doesn't seem to be the end of meteor strikes on Earth. Even NASA has advised us to prepare for another asteroid strike similar to the one that hit Tunguska and Chelyabinsk in Russia.